everyone. In this video, we're going to go over the organs and structures that are involved in the urinary system. In addition to that, make sure you also understand the function of the structures with a star at the end. Now, if we take a look at an overview of the urinary system, we can see that the kidneys are the organs that are involved in producing urine. From the kidney, urine is going to travel to the bladder via a structure called the ureter right here. From the bladder, the urine is going to travel outside the into the environment via a tube called the urethra. I'll show you a better view of the urethra in the reproductive system because we can't see the urethra from here. But essentially, we got the kidneys, we got the ureter. Since there are two kidneys, there are two ureters, and then this is the bladder. At the tip of the bladder, there is an area called the trigone. The trigone is an area where a lot of bacteria infections are stored here because it houses a lot of the bacteria. Now let's go ahead and take a closer look at just the kidneys by themselves. So if we take a look at the kidney, remember on top of the kidney, we have the adrenal glands. There's the adrenal cortex, which is the outer layer, and the adrenal medulla, which is the inner layer. But collectively, these are the adrenal glands. Then in the kidney itself, we actually have two layers of the kidney as well. The outer layer of the kidney is usually shown as the darker region in most model. This is the renal cortex. This is the outer layer, not the outer layer, but the more superficial portion of the kidney. And then in the middle part of the kidney, the area that's usually lighter in some kidney model, this is the renal medulla. So renal cortex, outer layer, renal medulla, more inner parts. In the renal medulla, you can see that there are these tiny striations within the renal medulla. These tiny striations right here are called the renal pyramid. So renal medulla, and then inside the renal medulla, you can see the striation that is the renal pyramid. Now you can see the separation of some lobes here. So between the renal medulla, you can see a lighter portion here. This is called the renal column. So there's a renal column here, there's a renal column here, there's a renal column here, and there's a renal column here. So as a review, adrenal glands on top of the kidney, outer layer, renal cortex, inner layer, you got the renal medulla, renal medulla, renal medulla. In between each renal medulla, there's the renal column. And then if we take a closer look at the renal medulla itself, these striation, they form the renal pyramid. All right. Another thing that I want to mention as well is that you have blood vessels coming in to the kidneys. So you have the renal artery and the renal veins here. I'll show you more pictures and a more closer look at these arteries again in a couple slides, but just keep that in mind. Now, this portion of the kidney, we can find the major and the minor calyxes. So urine and blood are filtered, and then once you have urine finally produced, they're going to travel to the minor calyx right here. So this is the minor calyx. You got one minor calyx here, one minor calyx here, one minor calyx here, one minor calyx here, so on and so forth. And then the minor calyxes, what they're going to do is put the urine into the major calyx. This right here is going to be the major calyx in the middle part. And from the major calyx, it's going to leave, the urine is going to leave the kidney via the renal pelvis. And the renal pelvis actually takes the kidney into this structure right here, which is the ureter, which takes the urine, to the bladder. So again, minor calyx, minor calyx, minor calyx, drains it into the major calyx, takes it to the renal pelvis, and then out to the ureter, which takes the urine to the bladder. But we're not done with the kidney models itself. We need to take a look at the blood vessels that are in the kidney. So going back to the blood vessels, we have the renal artery and the renal veins. So the renal artery takes blood to the kidney, the renal veins takes deoxygenated blood away. Now, the renal artery, it's going to divide up into the segmental artery. And the segmental artery will then, you can see, branch out into the renal column, and the branching of the renal artery from the segmented artery is going to branch off into the interlobar artery. So this is the interlobar artery here. This is the interlobar artery here. This is the interlobar artery here. The interlobar artery is going to branch off into the arcuate artery. And then the arcuate artery are going to branch off into the specific renal cortex area. And then this right here is the cortical radiate artery. So as a review, you got the renal artery, branches off to the segmental artery. Segmental artery branches off into each individual renal column. This is the interlobar artery. The interlobar artery branches off into the arcuate artery, which branches off into the cortical radiate artery. Now the renal veins are going to do the same thing. Okay, so the renal veins, let's actually start with the cortical radiate vein. These right here are the cortical radiate vein. They take the deoxygenated blood back to the cortical radiate veins. They take the deoxygenated blood back to the arcuate vein, which takes it to the interlobar vein, and that drains it back into the renal vein. Notice how there is not a segmental veins. We don't have the segmental veins inside of the kidney. So that is the blood vessels in the urinary system. Now let's go ahead and take a closer look at the nephron. You'll find the nephrons right here in the renal cortex area. We have 1,000,000 nephrons inside the kidney, and the nephron is the actual unit where urine is produced. So let's take a closer look at this area right here so we can see the actual nephron. So what we see here is a couple nephrons. Essentially, the nephron, we start off with the glomerulus, and the glomerulus capsule, to be precise, is where blood filtration happens. This is the beginning part of urine production. Now, if we take a look at the glomerulus capsule and we take a closer look at it just by itself, you can see that within the glomerulus capsule, which is this entire portion right here, the actual glomerulus itself is the slits where blood is getting filtered. This entire thing is called the glomerulus capsule, also known this entire thing is also known as the glomerulus capsule. But the entire portion right here where we're looking at how urine is actually being produced through the blood filtration, this is the glomerulus, this is the glomerulus capsule. You have the afferent arterioles, this is how blood comes in, and then you have the efferent arterioles. These are the blood that have been so when the blood comes in, they get filtered. Any remaining blood is going to leave via the efferent arterioles. So afferent arterioles, blood coming in, things get filtered out. Any remaining blood will then leave via the efferent arterioles. So this is the essentially beginning part of the blood filtration of urine production. So if you're curious, this entire thing right here, it's the beginning portion. All right, so now let's go ahead and move on into the actual mechanism. So from the glomerulus capsule right here, we have the portion that gets filtered through. So remember, we have the filtration slits here. Anything that passes through the filtration slits will then end up in a collection of loops. So the loops that starts off, that's very close to the glomerulus capsule, this is called the proximal convoluted tubule. The proximal convoluted tubule is going to go down here into the actual nephron loop. We have the descending nephron loop, and then we have the ascending nephron loop. Okay. The nephron loop, once it gets further out, it becomes the distal convoluted tubule. Anything that doesn't get reabsorbed at this point is going to end up in the collecting duct. So in the collecting duct, we actually have formed urine at this point. The collecting duct is going to take the urine into the minor calyx, which takes it to the major calyx, which takes it to the renal pelvics, and then that ends up in the ureter. So if you remember from the diagram that I showed you before. Okay. All right. And then the last thing that I want to show you in this diagram is the network of capillaries that run into the nephron. And these are the paratubular capillaries right here. I want to do a quick review before we end this video. So essentially what you're looking at here is the nephron. It's a functional unit that produces urine inside of the kidney, specifically in the renal cortex area. At the beginning of the nephron, we have the renal corpuscle, which includes the glomerulus, these slits that you see here, and the glomerulus capsule. Excuse me. When blood comes in to the glomerulus capsule, it comes in via the afferent arterioles. The blood brings along with it a lot of fluid. Some of the fluid gets filtered out, and so it's going to go through here. Anything that doesn't get filtered out will then go back into your body via the efferent arterioles. Now let's look at the stuff that gets filtered through. It's going to end up in the proximal convoluted tubule, which is right next to the glomerulus. The proximal convoluted tubule takes it to the nephron loops. You have the descending nephron loop, the ascending, and then from the ascending, it's going to end up in the distal convoluted tubule. Anything that doesn't get reabsorbed back into your bloodstream at this point will end up in the collecting duct. The collecting duct, this is where we find urine formation. And the urine formation in the collecting duct will then leave your urine. I also want to note too that these are the paratubular capillaries, which is a network of gas exchange that occurs inside of the kidney, specifically near the nephron loop. Okay, this wraps up the urinary system. I'll see you in the next video. Thanks for listening.